In the grand cacophonous theater of modern discourse, where pundits scream over one another for a fragment of your attention, and the 24-hour news cycle devours reality only to vomit it back up as entertainment, there exists a curious silence. It is a silence shaped like a man. If you look at the architecture of human thought in the 20th and 21st centuries, you will find a towering skyscraper of intellect, a structure so massive it blocks out the sun for lesser academics. This is Noam Chomsky. And yet, if you were to turn on your television, flip through the major networks, or scroll through the curated feeds of the corporate press, you would be forgiven for thinking he does not exist. Here lies the primary paradox, the delicious irony that we must savor before we can even begin to understand the man. He is arguably the most cited living scholar on the face of the earth, a mind compared to Galileo, Newton, and Descartes, yet he is treated by the mainstream media with the sort of nervous apprehension usually reserved for a bomb disposal unit. Why is it that the man who unlocked the biological code of language, the very thing that makes us human, is systematically erased from the conversation about how we use that language to govern ourselves? It is because he commits the ultimate sin of the intellectual. He doesn't just analyze the game. He exposes the fact that the game is rigged, and he does so with a calm, terrifying precision that makes the powerful feel uniquely naked.
To understand Noam Chomsky is to accept that there are, in effect, two of them. It is a Jekyll and Hyde situation. If Dr. Jekyll were a soft-spoken linguistic genius, and Mr. Hyde were a relentless dismantling machine of American imperialism. On one side, we have the Einstein of linguistics. This Chomsky is safe. He is celebrated in the hallowed halls of MIT. He is the recipient of honorary degrees that would fill a warehouse. This Chomsky is the darling of computer scientists and cognitive psychologists, the man who proved that the ability to speak is not a learned trick like a dog shaking hands, but a biological imperative hardwired into our genetic soul. But then there is the other Chomsky, the enemy of the state, the dissident. This is the man who looks at the moral pronouncements of the West and laughs, a dry, mirthless chuckle. This is the man who points out, with infuriating abundance of footnotes, that the emperor is not only naked, but is also currently bombing a wedding party in a country you can't find on a map. The media loves the Einstein because he makes them feel smart. They despise the dissident because he makes them feel complicit. The tragedy and the comedy of his life is that the establishment cannot celebrate one without inadvertently giving a platform to the other. They want the genius who explains syntax. They dread the prophet who explains genocide.
Let us dwell for a moment on the specific nature of his exile from the public square. It is not that he is banned. Censorship in a free society is far more sophisticated than a simple ban. As Chomsky himself would tell you, with that serene, grandfatherly demeanor that makes his radicalism all the more unsettling, the system works better when it gives the illusion of debate. The media allows for a spectrum of opinion, yes, but that spectrum is rigorously confined between 2 points, Establishment A and Establishment B. Chomsky exists somewhere off the chart, in a dimension of truth that corporate sponsors find indigestible. He is the ghost in the machine of modern democracy. When the New York Times or the BBC ignore him, it isn't out of ignorance, it is out of a survival instinct. To interview Chomsky on primetime is to invite a man who will not speak in sound bites. He will not accept the premise of your question. If you ask him, should we bomb country X to save them, he will patiently deconstruct the historical economic interests that led to the crisis, cite 3 similar interventions that resulted in catastrophe, and conclude that the question itself is a form of imperialist propaganda. This is simply bad television. It interrupts the flow of commercials. It makes the audience uncomfortable. It forces the viewer to look in the mirror and see not a citizen of a noble republic, but a cog in a violent machine. And nobody buys toothpaste after being told they are complicit in war crimes.
Quantifying the weight of a human mind is usually a fool's errand. Yet in the academic world, we have metrics, cold, hard numbers that serve as the scorecard of immortality. By these metrics, Noam Chomsky is a titan walking among ants. He is one of the most cited scholars in all of human history. We are talking about a league that includes the Bible, Marx, Lenin, Shakespeare, and Aristotle. Think about that list. It is a list of gods, prophets, and revolutionaries. And then there is Noam, a quiet man from Philadelphia who likes to wear cardigans. This statistical dominance is not merely a piece of trivia. It is evidence of a gravitational pull. You cannot study linguistics without him. You cannot study cognitive science without him. You cannot study computer science, philosophy of mind, or political analysis without crashing into his ideas. He is the bedrock. Even his fiercest critics, and there are legions of them, foaming at the mouth, must build their arguments on the foundations he laid. They climbed the mountain of his work just to try and plant a flag saying he is wrong. It is a delicious paradox that the institutions which he relentlessly critiques, the universities, the elite intellectual circles, are the very ones that have canonized him. He is the virus that the host body has decided to worship.
But where does a mind like this come from? It did not spring fully formed from the ether. Noam Chomsky was forged in the fires of the Great Depression, born in 1928 in Philadelphia to Jewish immigrants fleeing the encroaching darkness of Eastern Europe. This was not a childhood of scrolling through TikTok or watching cartoons. This was a childhood where the air was thick with the dust of economic collapse and the rising smoke of fascism across the ocean. He grew up in a household where Hebrew scholarship was the oxygen they breathed. His father, William, was a noted scholar of the Hebrew language, and young Noam was reading proofs of 13th century historical grammar while other children were playing stickball. Imagine a 10-year-old boy witnessing the unemployed men knocking on the back door selling rags, watching the security of the world dissolve, and realizing that authority figures, the police, the politicians, the bankers, had no idea how to fix it. He saw early on that the structures of power were fragile, incompetent, and cruel. This was the soil in which the seeds of his anarcho-syndicalism were planted. He didn't learn about class struggle from a textbook in a posh university. He learned it by watching his neighbors disappear into poverty while the factories stood silent.
There is a specific locus of his education that deserves a cinematic spotlight: his uncle's newsstand in New York City. In the mythology of Chomsky, this newsstand is as significant as Newton's apple tree. It was a gathering place for the working-class intelligentsia, a phrase that sounds like an oxymoron today, but in the 1930s, it was reality. These were factory workers, tailors, and the unemployed who read Marx and Freud, who debated the Spanish Civil War with the ferocity of generals. Young Noam would travel there on the train, leaving the structured world of school for this chaotic, vibrant salon of the street. It was here that he learned the most dangerous lesson of all, that wisdom does not require a diploma. He saw that the so-called uneducated masses possessed a clarity of political vision that the professors lacked. He saw that the working class understood the boot on their neck better than the sociologists studying the boot. This experience inoculated him against the elitism of the Ivy League. He would go on to inhabit the most prestigious universities in the world, but he never forgot the smell of ink and cheap tobacco at that newsstand. He remained, in his heart, a spectral figure standing on a New York street corner, skeptical of everything, trusting only the logic of the argument, never the rank of the speaker.
Then came the linguistic revolution. To understand the scale of what Chomsky did to linguistics, you have to understand that before him, the dominant theory was behaviorism. This was the idea, championed by B.F. Skinner, that humans are just empty vessels, blank slates, who learn language solely by imitation and reinforcement. We are parrots, essentially, waiting for a cracker. Chomsky looked at this and, with the polite devastation of a nuclear strike, proved it was nonsense. In 1957, with syntactic structures, he proposed that language is innate. He argued that we are born with a universal grammar, a biological template in our brains that allows us to generate an infinite number of sentences from a finite set of rules. It sounds technical, but the philosophical implication is life-shattering. It means human beings are not clay to be molded by the state or corporations. We are born with a nature. We have an intrinsic creativity, a built-in freedom that cannot be conditioned out of us. He didn't just change grammar, he restored the human soul to science. He proved that creativity is our birthright, not a learned behavior. It was a scientific defense of human dignity disguised as a theory of syntax.
Most academics would have stopped there.
They would have taken their tenure, bought a nice house in Cambridge, and spent the rest of their lives attending dinner parties, basking in the glow of their own brilliance. But Chomsky has a defect. He possesses a conscience. In the 1960s, as the United States began to tear Vietnam apart, Chomsky stepped out of the ivory tower and into the mud. He published The Responsibility of Intellectuals in 1967, an essay that effectively set fire to his own safety net. He argued that intellectuals, the writers, the professors, the experts, have a unique moral responsibility to speak the truth and expose lies, precisely because they have the privilege of liberty and access to information. He accused his colleagues of being the handmaidens of power, technocrats who used their degrees to justify slaughter. This was not a popular move. He went from being a celebrated scientist to a man on Nixon's enemies list. He was arrested, he was threatened, he was facing long prison sentences, and he did it with a calm, almost robotic consistency. He treated the Vietnam War not as a mistake or a quagmire, but as a crime, and in doing so, he cemented his dual legacy: the genius who defined the mind, and the pariah who defined the crime.
The scope of his influence is so vast it borders on the absurd. While he was busy dismantling American foreign policy, his linguistic theories were quietly laying the groundwork for the digital age. You see, when you define the rules of grammar mathematically, as Chomsky did, you create a bridge between human language and machine code. Computer languages, compilers, the very logic that allows you to talk to Siri or Alexa, they all rest on the hierarchy of grammars he classified. The Chomsky hierarchy is still taught in every Computer Science 101 class in the world. Here lies the deepest, most serene irony of all. The systems of artificial intelligence, the algorithms of big tech that now track our movements, manufacture our consent, and narrow our political horizons, they are built, in part, on the logic discovered by the man who hates them the most. He is the unwilling architect of the digital panopticon. He gave us the keys to understand the mind, and Silicon Valley used them to build a better cage. It is a testament to the neutrality of science. A theorem doesn't care if it's used to liberate a mind or to program a drone.
And so we arrive at the present moment. The man is in his 90s. His body is frail. His voice is a whisper, barely a rasp of air over vocal cords. Yet he continues. He answers emails from strangers at 3 a.m. He gives interviews to tiny, independent radio stations. He writes book after book, warning us of the twin precipices of nuclear war and climate catastrophe. He is the enemy of the state because he refuses to let us sleep. He refuses to let us accept the comfortable lies that keep society functioning smoothly. As we embark on this journey through his life, his theories, and his secrets, remember this: we are not just studying a linguist, we are studying a mirror. Noam Chomsky is the reflection of our own potential for brilliance and our own capacity for horror. He is the Einstein who refused to just do the math. He is the man who looked at the power of the word and decided to use it against the power of the sword. In a world of noise, his whisper is the loudest sound in the room. Let us begin to listen.
Let us begin in the bleak, sterilized corridors of mid-20th century academia, a time when the human soul was effectively outlawed by science. The reigning monarch of the mind was B.F. Skinner, a man who looked at the infinite complexity of human consciousness and saw only a rat in a box, pressing a lever for a pellet. This was the era of behaviorism, a joyless philosophy asserting that you, my dear friend, are nothing more than a bundle of reflexes, conditioned by rewards and punishments. They believed the mind was a blank slate, a tabula rasa, waiting for the world to write instructions upon it. It is a terrifying thought, is it not? To believe that your love, your poetry, your existential dread are merely the result of positive reinforcement, akin to training a circus bear to dance. Skinner argued that language, the very medium we are using to dissect reality right now, was merely verbal behavior. He claimed we learn to speak exactly as a dog learns to sit, by mimicry and reward. It was a comfortable lie.
It promised that if we could just control the environment, we could engineer the perfect human. But perfection, as always, is a prison.
Into this confident, concrete cathedral of behaviorism walked a soft-spoken young man from Philadelphia, armed not with laboratory animals, but with logic. Noam Chomsky was barely 30, yet he possessed the serene, terrifying confidence of someone who has seen the code of the Matrix. He did not simply disagree with Skinner. He dismantled him with the precision of a watchmaker taking apart a bomb. In 1959, Chomsky published a review of Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior. It sounds like a mundane academic exercise, does it not? A book review. But make no mistake, this was an execution. Chomsky looked at the behaviorist model and asked a simple, devastating question. If language is just mimicry, how do you explain creativity? How is it that every day you utter sentences that have never been spoken before in the history of the universe? You are not a parrot repeating noises for a cracker. You are a generative engine of infinite possibility. Chomsky realized that treating humans as input-output machines wasn't just scientifically wrong, it was philosophically repugnant. He saw the ghost in the machine, and he was determined to prove that the ghost had its own rules. To understand the violence of this intellectual revolution, we must look at the weapon Chomsky utilized, the argument from the poverty of the stimulus. It is a phrase that sounds dry, like old parchment, but it contains a realization that shatters the idea of learning as we know it. Consider the human child, a biological accident, drooling and confused, surrounded by a chaotic storm of fragmented speech. Parents stutter, they interrupt themselves, they use slang, they leave sentences unfinished. The data input is, quite frankly, garbage. It is impoverished. And yet, by the age of 3 or 4, that same child, who cannot yet tie their shoes or control their own bladder, has mastered a complex, hierarchical system of grammatical rules that the world's smartest computers still struggle to replicate perfectly. How? If Skinner were right, the child should only be able to repeat what they hear. But the child says things they have never heard. They apply rules to new words. They possess a competency that vastly exceeds the data they were exposed to. Chomsky smiled his ironic smile and pointed out the obvious. You cannot learn a structure this complex from data this poor, unless you already know the rules before you start. The game is rigged. You were born knowing how to play.
This leads us to the concept of universal grammar, the holy grail of Chomskyan linguistics. If we are not blank slates, then what are we? We are pre-programmed hardware. Chomsky proposed that the ability to learn language is not a skill we acquire, like playing chess or driving a car. It is a biological organ, as physical and innate as your heart or your liver. We do not learn to grow arms, our genetic code commands it. Similarly, we do not learn language. Our language acquisition device, a theoretical module in the brain, grows it. This assertion was a thunderclap. It meant that at a fundamental level, all human languages, from English to Swahili, from Mandarin to Piraha, are exactly the same. They are merely different dialects of human. An alien visiting Earth would conclude that we all speak the same language, just with different vocabularies. It suggests a shared, immutable human nature, a biological brotherhood that transcends culture and geography. While the behaviorists wanted to mold us, Chomsky showed us that we come into this world with a blueprint already stamped on our souls. We are free because we are constrained by our own nature.
But Chomsky needed to prove that syntax, the structure of language, is independent of semantics or meaning. He needed to show that the rules exist in a vacuum, separate from the real world. To do this, he crafted a sentence that has become legendary in the annals of cognitive science, a sentence that is simultaneously nonsense and perfection. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Read it again. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. It is a logical absurdity. Ideas cannot be green, nor colorless. If they are colorless, they cannot be green. Ideas do not sleep, and if they did, they certainly would not do so furiously. The probability of these words appearing together in a statistical model is 0. Yet you, my intelligent friend, recognize instantly that it is a grammatically correct sentence. You know it is a noun phrase followed by a verb phrase. You sense its rhythm. Compare it to furiously sleep ideas green colorless. That is merely word salad. This distinction proved that our brains have an internal syntax generator that functions independently of reality. We are capable of constructing perfect structures that mean absolutely nothing. It is a beautiful, erotic metaphor for the human condition, isn't it not?
Now, let us descend into the machinery. Chomsky was not satisfied with mere philosophy. He wanted mathematical proof. He began to map the formal properties of grammars, creating what we now call the Chomsky hierarchy. This is where the linguist becomes the computer scientist. He categorized languages into types, type 0, type 1, type 2, type 3, based on their generative power. This sounds esoteric, but it is the bedrock of the digital world you inhabit. By defining context-free grammars, Chomsky inadvertently wrote the Bible for computer programming. Before this, we taught computers like dogs, with binary treats. After Chomsky, we realized we could create high-level languages, code that has syntax, grammar, and structure, just like human speech. When you write a line of Python or C++, the compiler parses your code using the exact algorithms derived from Chomsky's theories on syntax. He was trying to understand the human mind, and in the process, he gave birth to the logic that runs the internet. The irony is palpable. The man who warns us against the tyranny of technology provided the structural laws that make that technology possible.
This rigorous formalization birthed generative grammar. Imagine a finite set of rules capable of generating an infinite number of sentences. This is the definition of the human mind, a finite machine with infinite potential. It overturned the statistical models of the day. In the 1950s, information theory suggested language was a Markov chain, a game of probabilities where the next word is guessed based on the previous one. Chomsky laughed at this. He showed that language has deep structures, dependencies that span across long sentences, connecting the beginning to the end in a way simple probability cannot predict. The dog that chased the cat that killed the rat is barking. The verb is barking corresponds to the dog, separated by a chasm of words. A simple probability machine falls into that chasm. The human mind builds a bridge. This concept of recursion, the ability to embed structures within structures indefinitely, is what separates us from the beasts. It is the mathematical proof of our uniqueness. We are the only creatures capable of thinking about thinking about thinking.
The shock waves of this work triggered what we now call the cognitive revolution. Before Chomsky, psychology was obsessed with the exterior. Measure the input, measure the output, ignore the black box in the middle. Chomsky kicked the black box open. He forced science to look inward, to model the mental representations, the hidden processes, the internal states. He made it respectable to talk about the mind again, not just behavior. This was the death of behaviorism as a grand theory of everything. Skinner's reputation never fully recovered. He died insisting he was right, a bitter king in a crumbling castle. Meanwhile, cognitive psychology blossomed. We began to ask how we remember, how we pay attention, how we solve problems, viewing the brain not as a reflex machine, but as an information processor. Chomsky didn't just change linguistics, he changed how we perceive our own consciousness. He returned the dignity of complexity to the human experience. We were no longer rats, we were computers made of meat, running the most sophisticated software in the universe.
But let us pause and reflect on the deep, serene irony of Chomsky's position. Here is a man who is a dedicated anarchist, a political radical who believes in absolute freedom from state oppression. Yet in his scientific life, he argues for biological determinism. He argues that we are not free to learn anything we want. We are constrained by our genetic grammar. We cannot speak languages that violate universal grammar any more than we can fly by flapping our arms. Is this a contradiction? Or is it the ultimate truth? Chomsky argues that without structure, there is no creativity. Without the rigid rules of the sonnet, there is no poetry. Without the biological limits of the human mind, there is no human understanding. Total freedom is just noise. True freedom,
the kind that allows for the infinite generation of ideas, requires a rigid, innate foundation. We are free because we are limited. We are creative because we are programmed. It is a paradox that sits at the heart of his work, a silent koan for the modern age.
So here lies the wreckage of the behaviorist dream. Round one goes to the linguist. By the time the dust settled on the 20th century, the blank slate was broken, and the Skinner box was empty. Noam Chomsky had proven that to be human is to possess a specific, innate, biological heritage. He gave us back our minds. He laid the foundation for the devices you carry in your pocket and the code that runs your world. But the war was not over. In fact, it was just shifting fronts. Because if the mind is a biological machine, if it is a system of rules and computations, then what happens when we try to build a machine that mimics it perfectly? What happens when the artificial intelligence we create begins to challenge the very definitions of language and understanding that Chomsky established? As we move to the next chapter, remember this. Chomsky defined what it means to be human by defining the limits of our machine. But what happens when the machine no longer has limits? Colorless green ideas are sleeping furiously, and they are about to wake up.
It would have been so terribly easy for him to remain in the ivory tower, wouldn't it? Consider the seduction of that life. By the mid-1960s, Noam Chomsky was already the Einstein of linguistics, the architect of a revolution that had secured his place in history before he was 40. He had built a cathedral of logic at MIT, a pristine structure of universal grammar where the rules were absolute, the variables controlled, and the chaos of the human condition was reduced to elegant, recursive algorithms. It is a warm, well-lit place, the Academy, where the coffee is hot and the tenure is eternal. But there is a particular cruelty in understanding the deep structure of language while watching that same language be weaponized to justify atrocity. The transition from the sterile laboratory of syntax to the muddy, blood-soaked trenches of political dissent was not a career move, it was a moral rupture. He realized with a heavy heart and a sharper mind that analyzing the mechanics of a sentence is a hollow victory if that very sentence is a bureaucratic order to incinerate a village in Southeast Asia. And so the scientist stepped out of the lab and into the street, knowing full well that the truth is a hazardous substance that burns the hands of those who hold it too tightly.
The catalyst was Vietnam, the great American moral crater. While the best and brightest in Washington were calculating kill ratios and manufacturing optimism, Chomsky began to dismantle their lies with the same surgical precision he applied to grammar. In 1967, he published The Responsibility of Intellectuals, an essay that landed like a grenade in the cocktail parties of the elite. He dared to suggest a scandalous truth, that intellectuals are not the guardians of truth, but the servants of power. He argued that the political class uses complex jargon not to communicate, but to obscure, to make mass murder sound like a sanitation project. It is a deliciously dark irony, isn't it? The man who spent his life proving that language is innate to the human species was now forced to document how that species uses language to destroy itself. He saw the euphemisms, pacification, collateral damage, strategic hamlets, and he decoded them. He showed us that when a government speaks of freedom, it usually means the freedom to exploit, and when it speaks of security, it means the security of the investor class, often purchased with the blood of the peasantry. He didn't just critique the war, he undressed the empire.
But let us not mistake him for a mere armchair philosopher writing scathing letters to the editor. No, the linguist put his body on the gears of the machine. He became a tax resistor, refusing to fund the war machine, a crime that carries a weight the IRS rarely forgives. He marched on the Pentagon in October 1967, standing shoulder to shoulder with Norman Mailer and the chaotic tide of the counterculture. He was arrested, of course. There is a profound dignity in the mugshot of a dissident intellectual. It is the only award that truly matters in a corrupt society. He shared a jail cell with Mailer, who described him as a slim, sharp-featured man with an ascetic expression. He faced the very real possibility of long-term imprisonment. He organized, he shouted, he stood in the rain. He traveled to North Vietnam to witness the devastation firsthand, an act that branded him a traitor in the eyes of the establishment. This was not a game. He was risking his liberty and his livelihood because he understood that silence is not neutral. In a moving train toward fascism, to sit still is to be carried along. Chomsky chose to pull the emergency brake, even if it meant being thrown through the windshield.
And then came the book, Manufacturing Consent, written with Edward Herman. It is the dissident's Bible, a work so devastatingly accurate that it effectively exiled him from mainstream American media forever. The thesis is beautifully, tragically simple. We are told we live in a free society, with a free press. We are told the media is a watchdog, barking at the heels of power. Chomsky looks at this with that serene, terrifying smile and says, no, the media is not a watchdog, it is a guard dog. It does not challenge power, it protects it. The propaganda model suggests that in a democracy, you cannot control people by force. You cannot simply beat them into submission as you would in a totalitarian state. Therefore, you must control their minds. You must strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow for very lively debate within that spectrum. This gives people the illusion of thinking freely, while ensuring they never stray from the path the owners have paved. It is the ultimate magic trick of modern capitalism, convincing the prisoner that he has the key, when in fact, he is the one who built the cell.
To understand how this works, we must look at the filters. The first filter is ownership. Who owns the media? It is not a public service, it is a business. Massive conglomerates, huge corporations whose primary duty is not to the truth, but to the shareholder. Why would a corporation that profits from war and oil allow its news division to aggressively investigate the military-industrial complex? It would be suicide. The second filter is advertising. You, the viewer, are not the customer. You are the product. The media sells your attention to other corporations. If the news is too disturbing, too radical, or too complex, the advertisers get nervous. They want a buying mood. They want content that flows smoothly into the commercial break for the new SUV. This creates a systemic bias toward the status quo. The news becomes a filler between the ads, a carefully curated narrative designed to keep you anxious enough to watch, but passive enough to buy. It is a closed loop of commerce masquerading as information, a feedback loop where dissent is filtered out simply because it is bad for business.
Then there are the filters of sourcing and flack. The media has a symbiotic, almost parasitic relationship with powerful sources, the White House, the Pentagon, the police. They need a constant stream of content, and these institutions provide it, free of charge. To challenge these sources is to risk being cut off from the flow of information. So the journalist becomes a stenographer, transcribing the official press release and calling it news. If they do step out of line, they face flack, the fourth filter, negative feedback, lawsuits, angry letters from think tanks, orchestrated campaigns to discredit the reporter. It is a discipline mechanism. And finally, the fifth filter, an external enemy to mobilize the population. It used to be communism, then it was terrorism. Tomorrow, it might be China. It doesn't matter who the enemy is, as long as there is one. Fear is the most potent tool in the manufacturing of consent. It makes the population huddle together, willing to trade their civil liberties for the illusion of safety. Through these filters, the raw sewage of reality is purified into the bottled water of mainstream news.
Chomsky proves this model not with rhetoric, but with data. He contrasts worthy and unworthy victims. This is perhaps his most chilling insight. When an enemy state commits a crime, the victims are worthy. Their names are splashed across the headlines, their suffering is detailed in gruesome clarity, and we are called to righteous indignation. But when the United States or its client states commit the same crime, the victims are unworthy. Consider the genocide in East Timor, carried out by the Indonesian military with American weapons and diplomatic support. At the very moment the U.S. media was screaming about the crimes of Pol Pot in Cambodia, an enemy, they were completely silent on East Timor. Why?
because Pol Pot could be used to demonize communism, while the slaughter in East Timor was profitable for American business. The corpses in Cambodia were useful, the corpses in East Timor were inconvenient. To Chomsky, this is the smoking gun. It reveals that the value of a human life in the eyes of the media depends entirely on its political utility to the empire. It is a calculus of death that is as precise as it is sociopathic.
This relentless decoding of the matrix is why Noam Chomsky became a pariah in Washington. You will rarely see him on the major networks. He is the ghost at the banquet, the unwelcome guest who points out that the emperor is not only naked, but is also covered in blood. The mainstream establishment cannot debate him because to engage with his premises is to admit that the entire system is fraudulent. They cannot dismiss him as a crank because his footnotes are impeccable, his memory is photographic, and his logic is unassailable. So they choose the only option left. They ignore him. They wall him off. He is world famous, yet invisible in his own country's corridors of power. This silence is not an accident. It is the system working exactly as he predicted. By excluding him, they prove his point. He exposes the Washington Consensus for what it is, a bipartisan agreement to expand empire, protect capital, and manage the rabble. He is the man who looked behind the curtain, saw the little man pulling the levers, and instead of being impressed by the wizardry, he simply asked, "By what right do you rule?"
There is a profound psychological comfort in believing the news. It is easier to believe that the good guys are in charge, that mistakes are just blunders or intelligence failures, and not systemic features of a predatory empire. Chomsky denies us this comfort. He demands that we look at the illusion of debate. Turn on the television. You will see a Democrat and a Republican arguing ferociously about tax rates or abortion. It looks like democracy. It looks like a clash of ideas. But Chomsky whispers the truth. They are arguing about how to decorate the prison cell, not about opening the door. They will never debate the military budget. They will never debate the morality of drone strikes. They will never debate the legitimacy of corporate personhood. The debate is strictly policed. By allowing vigorous argument over minor issues, the system reinforces the idea that there is no alternative to the major ones. It is a puppet show where the puppets fight each other to distract the audience from the strings. And once you see the strings, as Chomsky has, you can never unsee them. You are awake, and being awake in a world of sleepwalkers is a lonely, ironic existence.
So here lies the legacy of the dissident. Noam Chomsky teaches us that the price of freedom is eternal skepticism. He teaches us that intellectual self-defense is a civic duty. His life is a testament to the power of the solitary mind against the herd. He has been arrested, blacklisted, mocked, and ignored. Yet he remains, a calm, relentless voice in the wilderness of propaganda. He offers no comfortable lies, no easy hope. He offers only the tools to dismantle the cage. He hands you the wire cutters of critical thinking and says, with that grave, serene smile, "The rest is up to you." To read Chomsky is to lose your innocence, but to gain your dignity. It is to accept that we are being lied to, constantly, systematically, and effectively. But in that acceptance lies the seed of resistance. For if consent is manufactured, it can also be withdrawn. And that, my friends, is the most dangerous thought of all. The machine requires your obedience. Chomsky simply asks you to consider the possibility of saying no.
Deep within the labyrinth of modern academia, far removed from the sterile glow of the massive server farms that now define our digital existence, there exists a sanctuary of analog thought. It is the office of Noam Chomsky, a space that feels less like a command center and more like an archaeological site of the 20th century's intellectual battles. Here, amidst towering stacks of paper, worn-out books, and the quiet hum of a legacy that spans over 7 decades, sits the man behind the myth. To the outside world, he is a titan of linguistics and a firebrand of political dissent, a figure carved from marble. But zoom in closer, past the headlines and the televised debates, and you find a routine defined by a staggering, almost monastic discipline. It is here, in the quiet hours of the morning, long before the critics awake, that the real work begins, not with grand proclamations, but with the simple, rhythmic tapping of a keyboard, a sound that has remained constant while the world outside has shifted from typewriters to touchscreens.
One might expect a figure of Chomsky's stature to be insulated by layers of publicists, assistants, and gatekeepers, a fortress of solitude impenetrable to the common man. Yet the reality is a bewildering paradox that defies modern celebrity culture. Every single day, Chomsky engages in a ritual that has become the stuff of legend, the answering of emails. Not a select few, not just those from fellow academics or high-profile journalists, but thousands. He dedicates hours each day to clearing an inbox that acts as a lightning rod for the world's curiosity, anger, and desperation. This is not a delegated task. There is no intern ghostwriting his thoughts. It is Chomsky himself, sitting there, reading the thoughts of high school students in Nebraska, factory workers in Brazil, and activists in Gaza. It is a testament to a radical accessibility, a belief that if one professes to care about the people, one must actually interact with them, one by one, pixel by pixel.
The contents of this digital deluge are as varied as the human condition itself. Some write to him seeking clarity on the intricate syntax of universal grammar, hoping to unlock the secrets of the mind. Others write to challenge his geopolitical stances, hurling paragraphs of vitriol, which he often meets with calm, dry, factual rebuttals. But many simply write because they feel alone in a confusing world, looking for a grandfather figure of the intellectual left to validate their perceptions of injustice. He answers them all with a brevity that has become his trademark, curt, precise, yet undeniably present. In an era of automated responses and auto-replies, Chomsky's personal correspondence is a stark anomaly. It suggests a man who views intellectual engagement not as a career path, but as a relentless moral obligation, a burden of solidarity that cannot be set down simply because one has reached the age of retirement or renown. This legendary work ethic invites a question that borders on the biological. How? How does a man, now navigating his 10th decade of life, maintain the stamina to outpace intellectuals half his age? The secret seems to lie in a complete lack of distinction between work and life. For Chomsky, thinking is not an occupation. It is a metabolic process, as essential as breathing. There are no vacations from the analysis of power or the structure of language because the mind does not clock out. His longevity is fueled by a burning, almost impatient curiosity, a refusal to let the world settle into a comfortable blur of accepted truths. While his peers have long since retreated to golf courses or memoirs, Chomsky remains in the trenches of the present tense, driven by a philosophy that suggests the human mind is designed for infinite creativity, and to let it idle is a betrayal of our nature.
It is from this vantage point of deep understanding of the human mind that Chomsky views the rise of artificial intelligence with a skepticism that chills the techno-optimists. As the world hyperventilates over the capabilities of large language models like ChatGPT, hailing them as the dawn of a new consciousness, Chomsky sees something far more mundane and essentially hollow. To him, these machines are not thinking, they are mimicking. He views modern AI not as a step toward artificial general intelligence, but as high-tech plagiarism, a system that devours the astronomical sum of human output, only to regurgitate it in statistically probable patterns. He argues that we are confusing the ability to generate fluent syntax with the ability to understand reality, a distinction that is the very cornerstone of his life's work in linguistics.
The core of his critique cuts to the philosophy of language itself. Chomsky posits that the human mind constructs language from a limited set of rules to generate infinite meaning, a creative act that springs from an internal cognitive structure. ChatGPT, conversely, operates on the opposite principle. It requires terabytes of data to learn what a human child learns from mere snippets of conversation. This, Chomsky argues, is not intelligence, it is brute force computation. He describes these models as stochastic parrots, entities that can parrot the sounds of human discourse without having any internal model of the world, no concept of truth, and no capacity for moral reasoning.
They do not know what is, they only know what is likely to be said next. In his view, this is a profound failure to replicate the elegance and efficiency of the biological brain. Furthermore, Chomsky warns of the banality of evil inherent in these systems. Because they are trained on the internet, a repository of both human genius and human depravity, they inevitably absorb the biases, prejudices, and misconceptions of the collective. But unlike a human, who can reflect, critique, and choose to reject a hateful ideology, the model simply predicts the next word based on weightings. Chomsky sees a danger not in the AI becoming sentient and taking over like Skynet, but in it becoming a ubiquitous tool for the automation of mediocrity and misinformation. He fears a future where the unique, struggling, creative spark of the human intellect is surrendered to an autocomplete function that smooths out the rough edges of thought, leaving us with a culture that is perfectly grammatical but intellectually dead. This skepticism is rooted in his unshakable belief in the poverty of the stimulus, a theory he championed in the 1950s that revolutionized linguistics. He observed that children learn complex grammatical rules despite hearing imperfect, fragmented speech. They know things they were never explicitly taught. This proves, he argues, that the capacity for language is innate, a genetic endowment unique to our species. AI refutes this by trying to learn entirely from the outside in, requiring massive data dumps to achieve what a toddler does with a few years of casual listening. For Chomsky, the success of LLMs is not a victory for science. It is an engineering marvel built on a scientifically flawed premise of how the mind actually works. It is a bulldozer trying to simulate the delicacy of a growing flower.
The debate over AI highlights a fundamental aspect of the man, his resistance to fashion. Throughout his career, whether in behaviorist psychology in the 50s or neoliberal economics in the 90s, Chomsky has always stood against the dominant current. His rejection of the AI hype train is consistent with a lifetime of piercing through the illusions of the era. He sees the corporate rush to monetize these models not as a pursuit of knowledge, but as a pursuit of control and profit, further concentrating power in the hands of a few tech oligarchs. It is the political Chomsky and the linguistic Chomsky converging perfectly, the critic of state power and the guardian of human cognitive dignity, uniting to warn us against surrendering our minds to a black box owned by Silicon Valley.
Yet despite his grim warnings and his relentless schedule, there is a softness to the man behind the myth that often goes unnoticed. Those who have visited his office speak of a warmth, a gentle humor, and a profound humility. The same man who dissects American imperialism with surgical ruthlessness will spend 20 minutes discussing the weather or the health of a stranger's grandmother in an email. This duality is the key to his stamina. If he were driven only by anger, he would have burned out decades ago. It is love, a deep, rational love for humanity and its potential, that sustains him. He answers the emails not because he has to, but because he believes that every individual is a repository of that same creative aspect he identified in language so long ago.
As we near the end of this exploration, we are left with a portrait of intellectual endurance that is almost frightening in its scope. Chomsky's life asks us to consider what it means to be truly human in an age of machines. He challenges us to value the difficult, internal work of understanding over the easy, external retrieval of information. He asks us to trust our innate creativity over the probabilistic outputs of an algorithm. His legacy is not just in the books he has written, but in the example he sets, that the human mind is a miracle of nature, capable of infinite variety, and that it is worth defending against any system, political or technological, that seeks to constrain, simplify, or automate it.
The office lights eventually dim, but the influence remains. Noam Chomsky, the man who changed how we think about thinking, remains a stubborn anomaly, a fiercely analog soul in a digital world, a tireless correspondent in an age of disconnection, and a skeptic in an age of blind faith in technology. Whether you agree with his politics or his linguistics is almost beside the point. The sheer force of his engagement with the world, his refusal to look away, and his insistence on answering the stranger's email stands as a monument to the unyielding power of the human spirit. In the end, the secret to his stamina is no secret at all. It is the simple, stubborn refusal to give up on us.
As we draw the curtains on this exploration, we are left staring at a paradox embodied in a single man. Noam Chomsky sits at the intersection of two divergent roads, one paved with the rigid mathematical structures of syntax, and the other muddied by the chaotic, blood-soaked realities of geopolitical power. It is a dual legacy that seems almost impossible for one life to contain. In the quiet, dust-mote-filled air of his office at MIT, a revolution in cognitive science was born, dismantling behaviorism and proving that the human mind is not an empty vessel, but a pre-programmed engine of infinite creativity. Yet, simultaneously, outside those ivy-covered walls, his voice became the clarion call against the machinery of empire. To understand Chomsky is to reconcile the abstract with the tangible, to see how the man who mapped the atomic structure of language also handed us the blueprints to dismantle the walls of our own ideological prisons. We begin this conclusion not by looking at what he solved, but at the sheer magnitude of the questions he forced us to ask.
Consider first the landscape of the mind. Before Chomsky, we were told we were blank slates, mere products of our environment, learning language as a rat learns a maze. He shattered this mirror. He argued that the ability to generate language, to produce sentences never before heard in the history of the universe, is an innate biological endowment. This was not just a linguistic shift, it was a philosophical earthquake that restored human dignity. It suggested that creativity is our birthright, encoded in our very DNA, independent of state, class, or creed. In a post-Chomsky world, linguistics has fractured and evolved, moving into biolinguistics and computational neuroscience, yet every new discovery walks on the path he cleared. We now understand that the mind has an internal architecture, a universal grammar that binds all humanity together. This universality is the bedrock of his legacy, the scientific proof that beneath the surface variations of culture and sound, the human cognitive experience is fundamentally, inextricably shared.
But if the mind is free, why are people in chains? This is where the scientist meets the dissident. Chomsky's transition from the laboratory to the barricades was driven by a burden of responsibility he felt intellectuals had long abdicated. He saw the priesthood of secular experts, the technocrats and advisors, using their credentials to justify atrocities in Vietnam, East Timor, and Central America. His legacy here is the exposure of the neutral expert as a servant of power. He taught us to look behind the curtain of professional objectivity. In the decades to come, this lesson becomes more vital, not less. As we enter an era of algorithmic governance and technocratic control, Chomsky's warning echoes loudly. Expertise is not a substitute for morality. The legacy he leaves is a demand that we question the credentials of those who hold the keys to our destruction, reminding us that the truth is often hidden in plain sight, obscured only by the complex jargon of those paid to hide it.
Perhaps his most enduring tool for the modern activist is the propaganda model. In Manufacturing Consent, co-authored with Herman, he gave us the lens to see the invisible bars of our cage. He showed that censorship in a free society does not require a gulag or a ministry of truth. It requires only the market. By filtering information through the sieves of ownership, advertising, and access, the media creates a reality that serves the elite, while maintaining the illusion of vigorous debate. Today, the landscape has shifted from cable news to social media algorithms, but the mechanism remains the same. The filters have simply become digital. His legacy in political economy is the realization that freedom of speech is meaningless if the megaphone is owned by the highest bidder.
We are left with the unfinished task of democratizing not just the vote, but the very information systems that tell us what is possible and what is forbidden. There is a profound irony in how Chomsky himself was treated by the systems he critiqued. He became the most cited living scholar in the humanities, yet was systematically exiled from the mainstream American press. He was the phantom in the machine, acknowledged as a genius in linguistics, but treated as a pariah in politics. This isolation tells us everything we need to know about the boundaries of acceptable thought. His legacy is partially defined by this silence. It serves as a litmus test for the openness of any society. Who is the person you are not allowed to hear? In the future, as dissent becomes increasingly criminalized or algorithmically shadow-banned, Chomsky's persistence from the margins serves as a template for endurance. He proved that you do not need the blessing of the New York Times to reach the world. You only need the truth and the stamina to repeat it, decade after decade, regardless of the ridicule. Connecting these two worlds, the linguistic and the political, is his fundamental view of human nature. For Chomsky, we are not designed for servitude. The same biological creativity that allows a child to invent a sentence implies a natural instinct for freedom. If the mind is infinite in its capacity, then any system that limits human potential, be it capitalism, state socialism, or authoritarianism, is fundamentally anti-human. This is the optimistic core of his otherwise dark analysis. His legacy is the argument that the drive for liberty is not a cultural invention of the West, but a biological imperative of the species. As we look toward a future of increasing automation and potential subjugation, this idea offers a glimmer of hope, that the human spirit is not malleable clay. We may be beaten, deceived, and controlled, but the cognitive spark that defines us cannot be extinguished without destroying the organism itself. In his final years, Chomsky turned his critical gaze toward the rise of artificial intelligence, specifically large language models. While the world marveled at chatbots, he saw high-tech plagiarism and a fundamental failure to understand cognition. He warned that these systems describe what is likely, whereas the human mind understands what is possible. This critique may be one of his final, crucial contributions. In a post-Chomsky world, we face the danger of conflating data processing with understanding and statistical probability with truth. His legacy here is a guardrail against the dehumanization of intelligence. He urges us to remember that language is not just a tool for communication or data retrieval. It is the instrument of thought itself. To surrender our language to machines is to surrender our capacity to think, to imagine, and ultimately to resist. We must carry this skepticism forward as we navigate the digital singularity. However, the legacy remains unfinished because the threats he warned of have metastasized. Chomsky spent the latter part of his life sounding the alarm on the two existential crises, nuclear war and environmental catastrophe. He called the modern Republican Party the most dangerous organization in human history, not out of hyperbole, but out of a calculated assessment of their stance on climate change. He leaves us standing on a precipice. The unfinished nature of his work is literal. The survival of the species is in question. He did not provide a solution, he provided a diagnosis. The burden of the cure now falls on the generation that follows. His voice, once a lonely broadcast, must now become a chorus. The future of political dissent in a post-Chomsky world must move beyond analysis and into the realm of survival. The intellectual tools are there, but the clock is ticking faster than it ever did during the Cold War. We must also acknowledge the limitations. Chomsky was not a messiah. He was a man of the Enlightenment, holding fast to reason in an age of emotion and post-truth. Some argue his analytical style is too cold for the hot blood of modern identity politics. Others suggest his focus on American imperialism ignored the agency of other nations. These critiques are part of the legacy, too. To honor Chomsky is not to deify him, but to subject his work to the same rigorous skepticism he applied to everything else. A post-Chomsky world should not be a world of Chomskyites, blindly repeating his dogmas. It should be a world of critical thinkers who use his shoulders as a platform to reach higher, see further, and correct the blind spots he may have missed. The greatest tribute to a master of dissent is to dissent even against him, provided it is done with the same standard of evidence and moral integrity.
What, then, is the future of linguistics? It lies in the deep ocean of the brain, exploring the genetic mutations that gave rise to the language organ. The seeds he planted in the 1950s have grown into a forest of inquiry that spans biology, psychology, and computer science. The minimalist program, his attempt to strip language down to its most perfect, efficient computation, remains the guiding star. But the mystery is far from solved. We still do not fully understand how a collection of neurons generates the concept of infinity. The unfinished legacy here is the Galilean challenge, to understand the nature of the mind as physically as we understand the motion of the planets. He leaves the field not with a final answer, but with a better set of questions, challenging young scientists to look inward, past the behavior, into the very machinery of the soul.
And what of the future of dissent? It faces a world of surveillance capitalism that Orwell could scarcely imagine. Yet Chomsky's method, Cartesian common sense, remains the most potent weapon. It is the simple, radical act of applying moral standards to oneself. If we condemn terror by our enemies, we must condemn terror by our state. This moral truism is the unfinished project of civilization. As long as power seeks to mask its violence with virtue, Chomsky's work will remain relevant. He leaves us with the uncomfortable truth that there are no good empires, only powerful ones. The legacy is a heavy torch. It requires the courage to be unpopular, the discipline to read the footnotes, and the compassion to care about the suffering of people you will never meet. It is an exhausting, endless task, and he carried it for 90 years. Now, he sets it down.
In the end, Noam Chomsky's legacy is not a monument of stone, but a method of thought. He taught us that the world is intelligible, that the confusing noise of politics is actually a structured system of control, and that the miraculous complexity of language is actually a structured system of nature. He gave us the keys to decode both. As the screen fades on his era, we are left with his final, silent imperative. The world is not going to save itself. The institutions will not correct themselves. The truth will not reveal itself. It requires effort. It requires resistance. It requires you. The legacy is unfinished because it can never be finished. It is a horizon we walk toward, guided by the clarity he provided. The old anarchist has done his part. The rest of the sentence is ours to write.